Marlon Brando had watched generations come and go with the patience of a man who had outlasted most of what he had lived through. He had been young in an era when young meant something specific, when it carried a particular kind of danger, when the culture hadn't yet learned to commodify rebellion and sell it back to the people doing the rebelling. He had been James Dean before James Dean existed. He had walked into American consciousness in 1951 with a torn t-shirt and a way of standing that made everything that had come before him look like it was assembled from cardboard and good intentions. He knew what it felt like to be a new thing that the world didn't have a category for yet. He knew what it felt like to have people argue about what you meant before you had finished figuring it out yourself. He also knew what happened to new things eventually. The category got built around you whether you cooperated or not, and once it was built, you spent the rest of your career either confirming it or fighting it, and both options cost you something that you didn't get back. He had spent decades watching that process work on other people. He had spent decades watching it try to work on him with mixed results. By 1993, Brando was 69 years old. He had survived more than most. He had survived the adulation and the contempt in roughly equal measure, the early Oscars and the decades of deliberate self-sabotage that his critics interpreted as waste, and he experienced as the only honest response to an industry that wanted him to be a product rather than a person. He had survived the retreats to the island in French Polynesia, the wait, the long silences, the films that confused people, the refusals that became legend. He had survived, most importantly, his own mythology, the story that had been built around him across 50 years that bore a complicated and often adversarial relationship to whatever he actually was underneath it. He watched younger artists the way a cartographer watches new explorers, with interest, with the occasional private assessment that he shared with almost no one. What he said publicly, when he said anything at all, was a different matter entirely. The dinner party was in the Hollywood Hills, late spring of 1993. A small gathering at the home of a director whose table had a reputation for bringing together people who did not ordinarily share rooms, actors, writers, a musician or two, the occasional journalist invited on the understanding that the evening was off the record, the kind of gathering where the conversation moved freely because everyone present had agreed, implicitly or explicitly, that it would stay in the room. Brando was there. He came to these things rarely enough that his presence altered the atmosphere of a room without his doing anything to alter it. People became slightly more themselves around him, or slightly less. It depended on the person. His attention, when he gave it, was total and unperformed, and people who found themselves inside it understood that they might at any moment receive it fully or lose it entirely, and the uncertainty made the room more alive than it would otherwise have been. The conversation turned to music. Someone mentioned Nirvana. The record had been out for nearly 2 years and had thoroughly reorganized the cultural landscape, and even in rooms full of people who didn't follow rock radio, it had become a reference point, a shorthand for something that had shifted in the air, something generational and difficult to name precisely. Someone asked Brando what he made of the younger generation, the grunge kids, the flannel and the distortion and the deliberate ugliness that seemed to be both aesthetic choice and something more than aesthetic choice. Brando was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone processing the question, the quiet of someone deciding how much of what they actually thought they were willing to put into a room full of people. Lost, he said finally, a generation that doesn't know what it's angry at. Anger needs a target to mean anything. Unfocused anger is just noise with feelings attached. The table received this. A few people nodded. The conversation moved on. Brando had said what he had said. He seemed, to the people in that room, to have meant it completely. He had, and he hadn't. He got home after midnight. The house on Mulholland Drive was quiet in the way that large houses go quiet when the people in them have arranged their lives to minimize interruption. He moved through it without turning on many lights, a habit, not drama, and ended up where he often ended up late at night, in the room where he kept the things he was thinking about. Books open to pages he had been returning to, papers with notes that meant something only to him, a record player that still worked, a television he watched with the sound off more often than on, reading faces and bodies rather than listening to words, the way he had always believed you read people most honestly. He called his friend at midnight. The friend, an actor he had known for 30 years, someone with whom the normal scaffolding of conversation had long since been set aside in favor of something more direct, picked up on the fourth ring. Not alarmed. Late calls from Brando were not unusual. They were simply a feature of knowing him, like his silences and his sudden reversals, and the way he occasionally said something in public that required a private correction he would only make to one or two people. "I said something tonight that wasn't the whole truth," Brando said. No greeting, no setup. His friend waited. He had learned to wait. "I called them lost. The young ones. The rock kids. I said their anger had no target." He paused. "That's not entirely wrong, but it's not entirely right either." "What's the right part?" his friend asked. Brando was quiet for a moment. On the other end of the line, his friend could hear the room, the particular acoustic of Brando thinking, which had a weight to it that most people's silences didn't. "I heard that boy sing," Brando said. "The Nirvana one. My son was playing the record last week and I sat down and listened to it properly for the first time. Not as background, actually listened. Sat still and let it come in." Another pause. "He doesn't know where to put it," Brando said. "Whatever is in him, he hasn't found the container for it yet. That's different from having nothing. That's actually the more dangerous condition. When you have something real and you can't find the form for it, when the thing inside you is larger than any available structure, that's not emptiness. That's a different problem entirely." He stopped. "I said lost," he said. "What I meant was uncontained, which is not the same thing. Lost implies you had a direction and misplaced it. This kid never had a wrong direction. He just has too much of something and nowhere sufficient to put it." His friend asked if he was going to say that to anyone. "No," Brando said. And then, after a moment, "I'm saying it to you." The friend kept the conversation private for years. He was the kind of person who understood the difference between something told in confidence and something told as a performance of confidence. The difference between a real correction and a managed one. He had been around Brando long enough to know that the midnight call had been the former, a man accounting to himself, using the telephone as a witness rather than an audience. Brando had called to say something true that he had not said in public, not because he was afraid of the public version, but because the public version wasn't the right container for it either. A dinner party in the Hollywood Hills was not the place for the actual thought. Midnight to a friend of 30 years was the place for the actual thought. That was how Brando had always worked, saving the most honest version of himself for the smallest possible rooms. The friend mentioned it after Brando's death in 2004 in a longer conversation about what Brando had actually been like in private. It appeared in a small film journal, paraphrased rather than quoted directly, with enough specificity that careful readers understood what had been said and approximately when. Most people didn't read it carefully. Most people didn't read it at all. The journal had a small circulation, and the piece was about Brando's acting process, not about his opinions on rock music, and the Cobain passage appeared near the end as an illustration of something larger about how Brando thought. It surfaced briefly online years later, passed between people in overlapping circles, film people who also followed music people who had grown up watching Brando, anyone old enough to hold both names in the same hand without them seeming incongruous. They recognized it for what it was, a private correction, a man telling the truth to one person after telling a partial truth to a room full of people. The particular honesty that only becomes available after midnight in a quiet house, to someone you have known long enough to trust with the actual version. Kurt Cobain died in April 1994, less than a year after that dinner party in the Hollywood Hills. Brando was told and said nothing public. He was not the kind of person who issued statements about the deaths of artists he hadn't known personally. He had his own relationship with grief and loss, which was private and substantial and none of the world's business. And he managed it in the way he managed most things, internally, without narration. But the friend remembered that when Brando heard, he was quiet in a specific way. Not the general quiet of receiving difficult news, something more pointed. The quiet of a person who had said something partially true about someone, had corrected himself in private, and now would not have the opportunity to fully account for the distance between the two statements. He didn't speak about it. He absorbed it in the way he absorbed most things, completely without display, as the private cost of being someone who paid attention. What Brando had identified in that midnight phone call was something that critics and journalists would spend years trying to articulate in their own vocabularies. The uncontained quality, the sense of something real and large searching for a form adequate to hold it. The particular condition of an artist who has more to say than any available structure can accommodate, who hasn't yet found, or perhaps cannot find, the container that would let the thing be expressed without consuming the person expressing it in the process. Brando had recognized it because he had lived a version of it himself. Not identically. The materials were different. The era was different. The specific pressures were different. But the underlying condition was familiar. He had been there in the early years, before the method became a label and the label became a cage, when he was still finding the form for what he had to do, and the finding was thrilling and dangerous and completely unmanaged by anyone including himself. He had thrown himself at role after role, not because he understood what he was doing, but because the doing was the only way to understand it. The form had come through practice, through failure, through the accumulation of attempts. He had eventually found containers that could hold what he brought to them without breaking. Certain directors who trusted him enough to let him fail in the direction of something true. Certain roles that were large enough to receive what he brought. The work had survived. He had survived. Not everyone found those containers in time. Not everyone was given the time to find them. Some things look like anger from the outside when they are actually something that hasn't yet discovered its own name. Some generations look lost when they are actually carrying something that the available forms are not yet large enough to receive. When the thing being expressed is ahead of the language available to express it, ahead of the structures available to contain it, ahead of the world's ability to understand what it's looking at. Brando understood that distinction with the specificity of someone who had lived it from the inside. He had made it once at midnight to one person in the quiet of a house on Mulholland Drive, and then let it go into the night without expecting it to travel further. What remains is the shape of two lives that never intersected directly, but rhymed in ways that neither man was in a position to fully recognize. Brando, the actor who had been a genuinely new thing in 1951 and spent the following 5 decades navigating the consequences of that newness with varying degrees of grace and deliberate chaos. Cobain, the musician who became a genuinely new thing in 1991 and did not survive long enough to develop a relationship with his own consequences. Both had arrived in the culture carrying something that the culture immediately tried to name, package, and contain. Both had found the packaging insufficient and had, in their different ways, refused it. Brando through deliberate unpredictability, through the weight and the island and the decades of strategic unavailability, through a career that seemed designed to frustrate any simple story about what he was or what he meant. Cobain through the music itself, which kept insisting on something that the marketing couldn't quite capture, something that came through even on commercial radio, even through the layers of production and promotion, something that a 69-year-old actor heard on a record in his house one evening and recognized at once before he had words for the recognition. He called it uncontained. He was right. He said it once, at midnight, to one person, on the telephone, in 1993. That was enough. That was exactly the right amount. He doesn't know where to put it. That's not the same as having nothing. That's actually the more dangerous condition. Marlon Brando, private phone call, spring 1993.